Good morning and welcome to our next episode of Pantry Basics Deep Dive. This is a program where we take a look at some of the things that are the most basic items in our homes, and we take a deep dive or a closer look at how they get to us and the history behind them. My name is Taryn. I'm a registered dietitian with the Community Education Department at Robert Wood Johnson. I'm super excited to bring you this topic today because while this item may be pretty easy to come by in the grocery store, the history and the processing behind it is so much more complex. So I really want to get into it because today's topic is chocolate. It's February, so that means it's Valentine's Day. And so it would be, our best interest to really talk about the history and the processing that goes into bringing chocolate to us. It is a really long process, so let's get into it. The plant, so chocolate comes from a plant first and foremost. It is the Theobroma cacao tree. It's an evergreen tree that grows in tropical regions of Central and South America, kind of between Peru and Mexico. This is where this tree comes from. It's part of the Malvaceae family, which if you are familiar with taxonomic names, this is part of the Mallow family, which contains thousands of members, such as marshmallow, chicory, hibiscus, hollyhocks, and even okra. So really, really big family. And a hallmark of this family is something called mucilage, which is kind of exactly what it sounds like. It's a gooey and mucus-like substance that coats the fruit of, and the lining, kind of like the stems of this plant family. Chocolate, cacao is no exception. The cacao fruit comes from, again, the cacao tree, Theobroma cacao, and it has a little white star-shaped flower, pictured here. And from there, it is pollinated and a fruit grows, and it's pretty big. It's about the size of a football, and when it's ripe, it's bright yellow. And inside, it has this white, pulpy, gooey, and yes, very mucus-like texture of fruit. And where it grows, people tend to eat the actual fruit of it. There's more to the cacao fruit than just chocolate. There's a lot of uses for it as well. So that fruit is described as obviously slimy, but tasting kind of like mango or pineapple or all those kinds of tropical fruits. It sounds really yummy, but it's very difficult to import here and also quite expensive. But that white pulp is super important in the processing of actual chocolate and how we get to what we know on the market shelves as chocolate. So we'll get to that a little bit later. Members of the Mallow family have also been touted as helping soothe mucous membranes in holistic medicine. So there's not a whole lot of research behind that, but it is a holistic remedy that's been used for thousands of years. So take from that what you will. It's said to help soothe like an irritated cough, that kind of thing. The next thing I want to get into is talking about the actual processing of the fruit from tree to chocolate bar, and that is a very, very long process. So I've kind of cut it a little bit short, and I can walk you through the steps, but a lot of this has been industrialized, thank goodness. For us, what I have here is raw cacao seeds. So inside of that fruit, inside of that slippery fruit, are little seed pods, pictured here. And that's what we're working with when it comes to chocolate, not the fruit at all. We're talking about the seeds. So it's kind of like, maybe like how you would use winter squash seeds, like a butternut or a pumpkin, something like that. Chocolate is very similar in that regard. It's made just with the seed of the plant. The way that that's done, you leave a little bit of that white pulpy fruit on there, and you let that seed ferment in that gooey mixture for a week. And that fermentation helps develop the flavor, extract extra nutrients, and it's really part of both the flavor and texture development of chocolate. That's what gives its signature flavor. The next step of that is kind of removing that pulpiness, that fermented goo, and laying it out in the sun to dry for another week until the seeds are fully dried through. They haven't been cooked, but they are dried through. And that's what I have purchased here. These beans are purchased from Colombia, so a native region where the Theobroma cacao tree would grow. I also forgot to mention, Theobroma is the Greek word for food of the gods, which, I mean, come on, chocolate is so good. It kind of is, right? It's heavenly. So these are raw cacao beans, or raw cacao seeds that have been fermented. They have been fermented and they have been dried in the sun, and that is the only processing that this has undergone so far. When they arrived, what I have done is I roasted them. That's the next step in the chocolate making process. So that flavor development certainly happens during the fermentation, but roasting makes it kind of sweet. I described it as kind of how you go from bread to toast. So getting all those caramelly, complex flavors out of it by roasting it. And we're roasting it low and slow, right? So when it comes to seeds, you definitely don't want to burn them. These were roasted. These are the full seeds that were roasted and cooled. They were roasted at 300 degrees for 5 minutes. We lowered the oven temperature to 275 for another 15 minutes. And then we lowered the oven temperature again to 265 for another 10. And this is how they turn out. They're slightly darker, which means that we've done a good job roasting them and not burning them, but that flavor development is definitely there. The next step in this process, which again has been industrialized, thankfully, is to peel off the outer layer of the seed. I did this by hand yesterday, and as you can see, I have a Band-Aid on my thumb because it is a blistery process. Definitely a lot of friction used to get these skins of these seeds off. In the industry, they would be crushed and then dropped from a larger vessel overhead, and then a fan would be used to blow away this outer shell, this chaff. It's almost like how you would winnow grain seeds. So how you would get that outer layer off to get to that inner delicious kernel. So you can see there inside, we've got a perfectly delicious roasted cacao seed. This is 100% cacao mass or cocoa mass. It's been cooked at this point, and it kind of, the difference between cacao and cocoa, right? We can kind of use those words interchangeably. They don't exactly mean the same thing. Cocoa is the processed form of cacao. So we're kind of making our way through the process, and this is where that kind of shifts because we've heat treated it. This has been done at a lower temperature than might be done on an industrial level, right? I only heated up to 300. But we're going to refer to this as like a cacao bean or a cacao seed. Again, it's 100% cocoa mass. They break apart pretty easy. They flake apart. And if you've ever seen cocoa nibs in the store, that's what that is. It's pretty much the most basic form of cocoa or cacao that you can buy, the most unadulterated form that's available commercially. You really can't find these raw in the store. Like I had to purchase these online and they had to be shipped from Colombia. They're just not that easily accessible. And then I roasted them in-house. Cocoa mass refers to obviously the full cacao bean, which is about 50% cocoa butter and 50% cocoa solids. So those things can be separated out once this is ground down to like a fine paste, or it can be eaten as is. When we look at a chocolate bar in the store, for example, this one, this is like a little fancy one, like a Whole Foods kind of fancy chocolate bar. It is 88% cocoa. And what that means is that 88% of the mass of this bar, so say this is a 100 gram bar, 88 grams of it would be this stuff here. This, unadulterated 50% cocoa butter, 50% cocoa solids, that would make up 88% of this bar. The rest, those other 12 grams, would be made up of something like sugar or milk, if you're having milk chocolate. This is not a milk chocolate. The ingredients I have on here is bittersweet chocolate, this guy here, and then I have cane sugar and vanilla for flavor. So the cane sugar, there should be about 12 grams in here, and there are. So mass-wise, 88 grams of actual cacao, the weight of it, and 12 grams weight or mass of cane sugar. So it is slightly sweetened because chocolate is so bitter, right? We know that our dark chocolate can be super bitter. So I know some people definitely prefer to have a little bit of milk in there to smooth things out, a little bit of sugar to smooth things out, kind of like we do with coffee, right? Except it's in the solid form, and that's how we're eating it. And that's pretty cool. Something I also wanted to point out on our chocolate bar here is something called a fair trade logo. Fair trade is very important in the cocoa industry, and we'll get into that a little bit later. But here is the fair trade logo for your reference. So as we can see, it takes a lot to get from our cacao tree to our cacao fruit to our cacao seeds to a chocolate bar, right? There's a whole lot of processing that takes place, and a lot of it has been mechanized, but obviously that wasn't always the case. People have been eating and domesticating cacao plants for, I believe it's 5,000 years. We have evidence from at least 5,000 years ago that cacao was being ingested, and this comes from our Mesoamerican societies, our Amazonian peoples of South and Central America, drinking chocolate out of clay pots. That's what archaeologists have found, which is very cool. They would do the same thing, right? Take the cacao fruit, eat some of that fruit, ferment, roast, and then break it up into these little pieces, and then make a beverage out of it with flavorings to it, but it definitely didn't have that same sweetness that we put into chocolate today. They didn't use cane sugar. Occasionally there would be a little bit of honey, but they had it as a bitter drink. The translation of the beverage literally means bitter water. So the recipe that was used, it's not perfectly clear because it was so long ago, but it generally includes some ground up 100% cocoa made of roasted cacao beans mixed with water, sometimes corn, allspice, or there's another there's other indigenous plants that would add flavor to the chocolate beverage. And then a little bit of chili powder. So make it a little bit of spicy. So spicy, bitter drink. And people would drink this pretty regularly. A lot of times it was reserved for higher classes because, again, there's so much that goes into the creation of this product, but not nearly as much as we do today. So today, a lot of this has been mechanized, as I said before. The mechanization wasn't able to occur until the Industrial Revolution. So it wasn't really until the late 1800s, early 1900s, where we were able to grind these down to a paste that was fine enough to give us that smooth texture that we know chocolate to have. It was grainy, and it was really only had as a drink because we weren't able to have that like smooth, delicious bar before that time. So chocolate's relatively new. As we take our deep dive, it's kind of uncovered that we really didn't have chocolate the way we know it until 150 years ago, which is really wild because it's become such a pantry staple. From this step here, because most people are not eating it in this form, and to get it from here to here takes quite a lot of grinding. It's grainy, it's brittle, as I kind of showed before. You hear that? It's kind of like dried leaves. It's very dry, even though there is cocoa butter in here. It can melt. That gives it a melty property. So once you're able to grind it smooth enough, cocoa butter allows it to melt. That's what that special melt in your mouth feeling is all about. Cocoa butter can also be removed and used in skincare products. We've all heard of, using cocoa butter on your skin. And yes, that is from our cacao bean. That's from our cocoa bean. From that point, that grinding process takes hours. Even when a machine does it, it takes hours and hours and hours. Our tongue can detect really, really small particles, like grains of sand, right? And we don't like that grainy texture in our chocolate bar, right? We want to get it so smooth, almost like a flour texture, right? You can't really feel the grains of flour, so we got to get that to that texture too. I'm not doing that today because it would take the rest of the day, and we just don't have that time. But a lot of people can do this at home using a coffee grinder for an extended period of time, and then also a mortar and pestle. But again, to get it to that really, really fine grain, it really has been a mechanized and industrialized process. From there, milk powder began to be added to chocolate, right? Just like our coffee, we use a little bit of milk sometimes. That bitter flavor of chocolate is also smoothed out by milk. So milk powder added to the chocolate makes it into milk chocolate. And then you also add sugar, and it makes it a little better too, right? So now we're at the stage where we have like Hershey chocolate or Cadbury chocolate. All of these chocolate companies were started around the same time because that's when the advent of the chocolate bar happened, which is very cool, but also kind of recent considering the entire history of chocolate. So yes, while our industrialized history of chocolate is maybe just those last 150 years, there's a whole, 5,000 years of history up until this point. Most of it occurring in, again, Central and South America, because that's where the Theobroma cacao tree is native to. How did it get to be such a worldwide sensation, though? Well, when explorers started coming over from Spain, they met with the native people and discovered or were introduced to the concept of chocolate or drinking chocolate as they had it back then. They were so enamored with this product, they brought it back with them to Europe, and it became a widespread phenomenon in Europe. Everybody really liked this product. And the demand for it was really high, but South and Central America were really far away from Europe, and it was really difficult to acquire that product quickly and in time with the demand. So that work was outsourced, and unfortunately that is part of the history that we have to accept, is that it was outsourced to slavery in Western Africa, which even still persists to this day. And that is still a huge part of the cocoa industry, and it's something that we really do have to kind of face head on and understand that it is a reality of the industry, which is why I brought up the fair trade logo, and we'll show you that again because it is so important. Right here on the chocolate bar, if it is a fair trade product, they will tell you it is a fair trade product. Here's that logo again, a little larger so you can see it. Fair trade means that the farmers and the laborers who are growing and picking and processing the fruit are being paid. They are not using forced labor. They are not using child labor. And this is done through multiple agencies who audit this. The cocoa industry is also something that causes quite a bit of deforestation because the hunger for chocolate worldwide is so great that rainforests, where Theobroma cacao is indigenous to, rainforests are being displaced for one central product. And it's not a perfect trade-off. So a fair trade product will ensure that not only that people are being paid to produce this, but that there is an environmental consciousness and awareness when it comes to creating this as well. So when I purchased these beans from Colombia, I bought them through a fair trade company, which means that the farmers and the laborers who got this into this bag for me to be purchased were paid, and they were paid fairly according to the standards set forth. So when possible, really try to aim towards that as a humanitarian effort. So as we kind of finish talking about our processing for chocolate, a huge undertaking, obviously, and we talk about the history up from its advent until modern day chocolate, we can also talk about the nutrition, right? I'm the dietitian, that's why we are here. We are going to talk about specifically dark chocolate because milk chocolate and sweetened chocolate gets a little murky, whereas this pure cocoa mass here has a little bit more defined characteristics. For example, we always talk about chocolate and like, oh, it has antioxidants. And yes, that's true. It does have antioxidants in the form of something called flavanols, which are plant compounds that are good for our bodies. Obviously, dark chocolate, having more of those, it's in a higher concentration when it is not diluted with milk and sugar. Okay, so the darker the chocolate, the more of the actual product you're eating, the closer to the origin, the more nutrition. So flavanols are a component of chocolate. We also have a little bit of caffeine, which is something that makes us crave chocolate oh so much. It has about 1/10 of the caffeine that is present in coffee beans, which are also coming from a fruit, by the way. They go through a very similar process and they have a very similar flavor profile and they come from a similar part of the world. It's not really a coincidence, is it? They do have a little bit of caffeine in them. So if you are trying to avoid caffeine, or if you're very sensitive to caffeine, that is something to be aware of that exists in chocolate. When you're eating a milk chocolate product, it's not going to have nearly as much caffeine in it, right? Because again, our product, our pure cocoa mass has been diluted. It's not going to have much, it's going to have negligible caffeine in it, really. Oh, also, cocoa butter and white chocolate are essentially the same thing, right? White chocolate removes the cocoa solids, right? It's 50% of our cocoa mass is cocoa solids. The other 50% is cocoa butter. White chocolate is made exclusively from the cocoa butter, and it can have milk and sugar added as well, but it does not have the flavonols, it doesn't have the caffeine of the full cacao bean. The last component I would like to talk about that is contained in our cocoa or our cacao is theobromine. Theobromine is named, once it was discovered, after the plant itself, Theobroma cacao. So theobromine is a similar component to caffeine, except it doesn't have that same stimulant effect. It has a similar effect on memory, so it can increase our ability to remember things, and it also is a vasodilator, and a vasodilator means it opens our blood vessels, so it helps lower our blood pressure. It also, gives us the pleasure of eating it, right? Theobromine is the component that is toxic to dogs, and there doesn't exist much evidence, but Paracelsus, it was a philosopher from way back in the day who coined the phrase, the poison is the dose. If you have too much theobromine, it can have a way too much of an effect. So dilate your blood vessels to the point where your heart starts to overcompensate, and it can actually result in arrhythmia and even death if you eat too much. But that's generally not going to happen unless you're eating like a ton of raw cocoa mass every single day. But most of the time we're just having our dark chocolate or our milk chocolate in moderation, and that is just fine. Nutritionally, we're also talking about seeds, right? So when it comes to eating our fiber, when it comes to eating our fruits and vegetables, that's what we want. We want the fiber. Eating seeds and nuts is a great way to do that, and it also includes healthy fats. So just like eating pumpkin seeds or squash seeds or chia seeds, eating seeds is good for us, and cacao seeds are no different. We want to talk about our portion sizing, of course, so we're not going to be eating a ton at a time, right? Moderation is the key when it comes to all this. Chocolate is good for us in moderation, but the nutritional makeup, the nutritional profile is very similar to that of many other seeds. So it does have healthy fats, it has a ton of fiber, and a bit of protein in there too, and which is pretty wild. They kind of measure up to a lot of our nuts and seeds. That is if you're eating them raw or slightly roasted like they are here. In a chocolate bar, you're going to want to look for something with a really high percentage. A little bit of sugar it can help the medicine go down, right? But when we're talking about milk chocolate and if we're talking about white chocolate, those kind of vasodilation effects, that theobromine, that caffeine, and those flavonols are pretty negligible. So we're going to try to get to as close to the source as possible, which is what I'm trying to display today. Very bitter, but it can be made into something that's really, really delicious, and a lot of us have in our homes. I also wanted to touch on the flavor profile of the seeds. So there is a whole institute devoted to chocolate flavoring, just like there are people who are super into tasting coffee or tasting wine or tasting beer. These seeds have the flavor of the place where they were grown and where they were fermented. So I have mine from a single source in Colombia. These seeds are going to taste much different than ones grown in on the Ivory Coast, which produces 40% of the world's cacao. It's going to taste different than ones that were grown in Peru are going to taste different than ones grown in Ghana. So there's a whole science to tasting whether or not things are like fruity or they're like dry, like whether they're like a red bright fruit or a dried purple fruit, or they're citrusy, or they're floral. So there's a whole world of chocolate tasting that is, that's I guess a subculture that exists as well, which is kind of fun. So if that's something that you're into, you can super duper tap into that. The place is the International Institute of Chocolate and Cacao Tasting. You can check out their website. They have a whole map on tasting chocolate, and it can, I guess, give you a little bit more appreciation of where your chocolate and where your cacao is coming from. See if you can taste the difference. Here's the flavor map here, and if anyone is interested, definitely put it on your survey, and I can totally send you this flavor profile here, and also a recipe for roasting your own cacao beans if you are so interested in purchasing your own and trying this at home. Again, these come out pretty tough, and they are pretty bitter, but they are the basis for making every kind of chocolate product that we know. Cacao nibs are great on yogurt or in granola. You can find them on grocery store shelves just as is. I find them to be a great addition to smoothies because I like mine to have a little bit of texture to them, and it adds a great nutritional component as well. So I hope that gives you a better idea of where our chocolate is coming from, where it's been, where it's going, the history behind it, and how it got to us. If you have questions, please reach out. But that is our deep dive on chocolate for the month of February, and I hope you enjoy. Take care.